Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Deluge's Pro Tips Part 3. In today's video I'll be amongst other things talking about Wrestle vs Block and passing. But let's start out with setting up your team in the beginning of a match. There is a lot of variables that comes into play when setting up your team, especially if you are on offense receiving the ball. So let's try and focus on the defensive setups. A defensive setup is all about predicting what your opponent wants to do and then making that as hard as possible for him. There is basically two kinds of defensive setups. One designed to prevent passing plays and one designed to stop cage plays. Let's take a look at some setups to prevent passing plays. First off, look at your opponent's team and look at how much mighty blow, guard, frenzy and general strength he has to determine what three players you want to put on the line of scrimmage. Also, if he doesn't have block or wrestle, there's no reason to put your own block or wrestle guy on the line of scrimmage to simply get them killed, as a both down result for him will cause a turnover anyway. The ideal is of course to have your line of scrimmage players not knocked down at all, but if that's impossible due to strength or guard, then at least make it as hard for him as possible and make the players knocked down matter as little as possible. When stopping a passing play, you want to cover your sides more so than the middle. If you simply open up both sides, it will allow him to run down too many receivers and it will be too hard to cover them all. So I'd suggest to you to position the rest of your team either like this or like this. Now, the downside of positioning your player like this is that they don't cover as much as the field, and you can also frenzy a player off the field to start out with. However, it will funnel all of his receivers down through the middle and make them more clumped up and easier to cover. A more popular setup is like this. Now, this often allows for him to do a risky 1 or 2 die blitz down here. But have in mind that it's a narrow gap to run his receivers down, and they'll be clumped up down here and easy to cover. And you're covering more of the middle like this, so you're more likely that he can't run receivers down through the middle and only through the gap that he blitzes open. Let's talk about setting up to stop a cage. Stopping a cage again depends on a lot of things. Like with the passing play, try and imagine what your opponent is going to do. If he has a lot of scary mighty blow players, keep that in mind when choosing for who to go on the line of scrimmage. You can protect your players on the line of scrimmage from assists if he doesn't have any guard, or from fouls by putting players up like this. But if your opponent gets the kickoff result quick step, he can move his players down to yours and you can be in a lot of trouble, so use that at your own risk. There's a lot of debate on the subject of wrestle versus block, so let me start this out with saying that in general, block is better skill than wrestle. There's nothing wrong with having an entire team with only block and no wrestle, but I would not recommend any team to pick only wrestle and no block. Wrestle is in my eyes a defensive skill, limiting your opponent and being annoying. It is also great for blitzing down block players, but do keep in mind no armor roll is made, so your opponent can stand up next turn with you still lying down. In general, I'd say it's a skill that gets better and better the more block your opponent has, so it shines at higher team values, where it is invaluable on a few key players on nearly every team. And speaking of wrestle, remember to have it on ask. If your opponent gets both down, you can tick wrestle off to force a turnover. However, keep in mind that this means an armor roll, so make sure it's beneficial to you and not just his last move of his turn. Let's talk a bit about dodging. In this scenario, I want to move this gutter runner up next to his ball carrier. Now, I can either choose between taking a dodge or taking a GFI. Now, if we forget for a minute that I have dodge, then both rolls is a 2+ roll. So I can choose where I want to fall down, if I want to fall down here or if I want to fall down here. Of course, if the roll fails. Now, this can be important if I want to move somewhere else next turn. For instance, in this scenario, I might want to fall down here so I can move down and intercept him when he moves further down the field. A lot of people tend to be afraid of dodging into tackle zones, and would rather, for instance, take 2 GFIs than to take 2 dodges into tackle zones. Well, when in this case, these 2 dodges is more likely to work than these 2 GFIs if I've already used my reroll. I'll post a link in the description to a dice calculator where you can make all these scenarios and figure out what's actually the more likely to work. A lot of people seem unsure about whether the dodge skill works in conjunction with the break tackle skill. Well, it does. When a ball and chain player pushes a player that's either prone or stunned on the pitch, an armor roll is made for the downed player. It does, however, not work like piling on. So you have to bypass the armor roll regardless of the player being prone or stunned. Like that. Also, a ball and chain player will ignore the effects of foul appearance. Your ball and chain player can also accidentally move himself off the pitch, which will result in a turnover. Your chainsaw player adds 3 to the armor roll of others and himself, never the injury roll like Mighty Blow or Dirty Player. He also adds this to fouls and even to opponents who fails to dodge out of his tackle zones. And yes, this actually works with diving tackle. Let's talk a bit about passing. This player has 3 agility. So this means that, as with any other player, if he rolls a 1 on his pass, from either simply rolling a 1, or it getting modified into a 1 from him doing a longer pass, he will fumble the ball. If his roll after modifiers is a 4 or above, he will make an accurate pass. Anything between that number and 1 will be an inaccurate pass. A natural rolled 6 will always be an accurate pass. Now, when should you take a GFI before passing? Strictly mathematically speaking, if you don't have any pass or any rerolls, you should take 2 GFIs if you can make a 5+ roll into a 4+ roll, but only take 1 GFI if you can make a 4+ roll into a 3+ roll. Now, I could sit here and read them all out to you, but you'd probably just forget them. So, go and play with the dice calculator and either try to remember them or write them down next to you. Now, in-game, there's also the very important aspect of where you want the ball to land should things go tits up. As taking GFIs will not only mean that the ball would be here instead of up the field, but it will also mean that your thrower will be lying down. So when the ball is loose, your opponent can easily recover it. If your thrower just fumbles the ball, he's at least standing up doing it. There are lots of things to consider, and as I've mentioned before, make a reason for your choice. Don't just play as you always do. So, what's the difference between passing with +1 agility and with accurate or strong arm? Well, to simplify this, throwing with plus agility changes one of your inaccurate outcomes into accurate, but throwing with strong arm changes one of your fumble outcomes into accurate. So when does this make a big difference? It makes a big difference when you're doing throw teammate. When you're doing throw teammate, all the rolls is inaccurate, so the amount of agility your throwing player has actually doesn't matter at all when doing throw teammate. So when does throw teammate cause a turnover? Well, you'll cause a turnover if you knock one of your own players over who is standing. If you throw a player and the thrown player is hurt, then that won't cause a turnover. And even if you throw a player onto one of your players who's currently lying down and that player's hurt, that still won't cause a turnover. This is also true of any other way of knocking your players down. For instance, throwing a bomb. If you throw a bomb onto your own players and they're knocked down while standing, you cause a turnover. So remember to throw your players first up the field before running your own players up there, as if you hit your own players, that'll cause a turnover, but this has no way of causing a turnover if there's none of your own players to hit. Well, this has been Deluge, and I will leave you with this last advice. If you want to get better at the game, play against someone better than you, who won't let you get away with making mistakes. Then ask him what mistakes you made. Playing against a computer or someone worse than you will just teach you bad habits.